Welcome back to the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. Today I'm joined by James Varney, who you've been a journalist for a number of years, but we're specifically talking about your coverage when Hurricane Katrina struck. You live in New Orleans, you were there, and you were a journalist reporting on what was happening. Can you just start by talking to me about where you were when Hurricane Katrina made landfall and what you remember vividly about those first days? It's a whole story. Obviously, you have a full article that people can go read all of your accounts. But what really stood out to you about those first few days?
I think the first thing that stood out, obviously, was just how extensive the flooding and the disaster was in New Orleans. But that didn't happen right away, or at least it wasn't recognized as happening right away. So I live right on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain in St. Tammany Parish. It's about 25 miles from the city. So we knew rather suddenly that the storm was going to be huge. It kind of built up to a Category 5 overnight. And my family left. And as you say, I was a reporter at the time for the Times-Picayune, which was the New Orleans newspaper. So we stayed in the bureau. And when the storm hit, it had just toggled just a little bit to the northeast. That happens a lot with these hurricanes because they're kind of going in a counterclockwise. Well, the storm itself is going in a clockwise manner as the clouds and the winds in it go counterclockwise. So because it's like the minute hand going like this, it tends to kind of just shave New Orleans to our east. And that's what happened here. So it was a Category 3 that hit here, which did tremendous devastation where I live on the North Shore. And of course, was a Category 5 in the Mississippi Gulf Coast, which looked like Hiroshima after it hit it. But it was only the next day that we all learned that New Orleans was flooding. And so that kind of changed everybody's calculus.
And that is really, I feel like, where the majority of the damage and the devastation ended up happening. What was the reaction to hearing that, the levees broke and that there was such widespread, devastation, for lack of a better word, that happened in these communities?
Well, we learned about it in the morning. We had to go all the way to Baton Rouge to file a story because that's how far we had to go to get power. And that's where we saw on the TV that the flooding had started. And so we didn't know exactly how many canals the levees had broken at that point. We didn't know how long the flooding was going to continue. You didn't know if it was going to be the whole city. As it happened, the levees along the Mississippi River held. So you did have a dry zone there, sort of using the river as your baseline. And so a photographer and I managed to get into the city that night. And coming in, you didn't know where to go or how you were going to be able to get from point A to point B. You knew that the Superdome was a problem because you had heard that there was a lot of refugees there. You knew that out by the lake, everything was flooded. And you knew to the east in the Ninth Ward, everything was flooded. But you didn't know if it was going to come all the way to the river, if the whole city was going to wind up underwater or what. So we just kind of came into the city that night winging it.
And communication was very different in 2005 than it is today. Mm-hmm. Everyone has smartphones that they're just, being able to talk to, and without power, it becomes basically obsolete. So how was communications during that time period? And what did you see of, all these displaced people?
Well, communications were a problem. I managed to find a friend of mine. I used to live in the French Quarter on Royal Street. And a friend of mine has a little grocery store there. It's no longer there. And they had a landline. And one of the things you learned was the landlines didn't go out. So I was still able to talk to people in Washington, D.C., through this landline. And that became sort of a makeshift bureau for 3-4 days for us and David Grunfeld, a photographer that I've done a lot of work with. I did Hurricane Mitch in Honduras with him as well. And we just, after we realized that the Superdome was getting better, so to speak, or ending, the other big place you saw was the convention center. And I guess a lot of people watching on TV, they saw the Superdome and they saw the convention center. And you saw the helicopters dropping, I don't know what, but stuff to try and fill the breach. That was out at the 17th Street Canal by the lake. That was the image that most people saw on television. We didn't see that because we didn't have any television. And it was obviously it was surreal. You didn't expect to ever see anything like this. And the people that were coming out of the flood water, those that could make it, either by boat or by walking. You also had some Coast Guard and other military helicopters that had plucked people right off the roofs. Those people that were walking out didn't have any place to go. But I think one of the things I try to make clear in my story, and I'm not sure that people realize this, is everybody thinks it was sort of just insanity, right? And everybody screaming and yelling and running around. And it wasn't like that. It was extraordinary how peaceful in many ways it was. So outside the convention center, you had thousands of people. They were mostly African Americans, and they were just sitting there patiently in these folding chairs all the way deep on the wide sidewalks there. And I don't know how many of your viewers have gone to New Orleans, but this convention center is huge. I mean, it goes on for blocks and blocks and blocks. And so you had all those people lined up, and they were just waiting. And we didn't know really what for. And it took, I think, about 3 or 4 days before that started to get straightened out, and before any of the resources from the National Guard or the Army or what have you, it took that long for them to get to the city.
And so, do you think that, what happened in the days directly following Katrina was somewhat misrepresented, or do you think that it was properly represented because obviously it was extreme and they weren't getting maybe necessarily the help that they needed, even though like you said, it was more peaceful than people might have assumed?
Right. And I think that was the big part that did get misrepresented. And I think New Orleans kind of took a black eye early on because people thought it was just savage and that this brutal behavior had gone on in the Superdome and in the convention center and elsewhere. And there were problems. There was shootings, some of them by the police, right? But when you consider the scale of the disaster and what had happened to everybody, and the fact that it took many days before help arrived, people were incredibly peaceful and patient, I think. And the stories that were going around that children were getting raped in the Superdome and that there were all these bodies in the convention center, or gangs were going around there at night and terrorizing people, and all, that wasn't true. Now, the devastation and the flooding and the property loss and the lives lost, but really the property loss that so many people had suffered, that was all very real.
And so how do you think Katrina changed, the community in ways that may still linger today, 20 years on?
It definitely changed the city. So you had this huge population exodus. I think the population of New Orleans when Katrina hit was probably around 475,000 roughly. And I think it fell to 200,000 or less. So, I mean, that's just an enormous demographic change. Now, a lot of that has come back, but not all of it. And part of what came back was New Orleans kind of developed this cachet post-Katrina, right? Like, it's a cool place. It's always been a cool place. And there was a lot of people that were interested in helping, and projects were going on. So it did attract some considerable talent, but it took a very long time to get even near the former population levels. So that's something that has never really come back. The neighborhoods, there's a part of the city called New Orleans East, and that flooded completely. The whole thing was underwater. That neighborhood has never really come back. It was the black middle class in New Orleans lived there. There's a lot of Vietnamese community there, and it just it's back. But if I had to put a percentage on it, it would be maybe 75% of what it was. So that's been a problem.
And obviously, in your article, you talk about how you were covering the presidents coming in, and you were able to see, law enforcement and what people were doing in response, from the people in charge level. Do you think that they handled things well?
No. I mean, Mayor Ray Nagin was actually at the Superdome, and there was a famous image of him in a couple days after the storm kind of losing it. And I think he had a rag around his head and was kind of screaming and everything. It wasn't a great look. Governor Kathleen Blanco was completely invisible. I don't know. To this day, I hardly know what she did. And of course, the federal response famously was slow as well. Now, they also had to go to Mississippi. And of course, all of us in New Orleans weren't even thinking about Mississippi, which had been almost virtually wiped off the map. So, no, it wasn't a good response. It isn't true that they failed to evacuate people. People had a chance to evacuate. Most of the people that stayed did so by choice. So maybe you can do a better job of trying to get home the message that you really need to take off when something like this is happening. And I think obviously learned by experience, right? I'd been in New Orleans for a pretty long time, and people just didn't really evacuate for hurricanes. And so that has changed. But overall, I think that once they got going, once they got started, once President Bush realized the political hit he was taking here, he really did everything he could to try and help. But it wasn't fast enough.
Do you think that the national memory of Katrina has faded too quickly, or do you think it's remained a defining moment?
It's hard for me to say because I don't travel around the country and talk to enough people to really know. Obviously, this is the 20th anniversary of it. Anniversary is not something you want to celebrate, but and that will probably bring a lot of attention to it. You know, for a long time, obviously, there was a huge focus on this. Certainly for the rest of Bush's second term, I can't even remember how many times he came down here. 12 or 15 times he was down here. And the amount of money that was pouring into the city and got spent was amazing, right? I mean, just mountains of money that came here. So I think that people sort of like anything like this that happens, and we need to be clear on this. This wasn't a natural disaster in New Orleans, okay? This was a man-made disaster because the levees broke. It was a natural disaster in Mississippi, but here it was a man-made disaster. So I think that when storms happen again, like, for example, FEMA's response, right? When North Carolina got hammered last year and those places, you might remember FEMA, people were super critical of FEMA's response. So maybe they haven't learned the lessons that they needed to. But when these kind of things come up, I think people remember Katrina as well because it's sort of the apex of these terrible storms that hit the U.S.
So you and your news team won Pulitzers for the coverage surrounding Katrina. So what do you remember most? What was the thing that stands out to you the most? And what was, maybe the most courageous thing you saw and the most heartbreaking thing that you saw while you were covering this?
Well, I mentioned in the story what was maybe a little of both, but was certainly heartbreaking at the time. I'm walking on the Convention Center Boulevard, and these people approach me frantic, and their daughter or sister was crumpled on the sidewalk, crowning. She was having a baby. She was going into labor. And I've talked with a lot of friends of mine. In fact, a federal employee in Atlanta, who's a good friend of mine, was in New Orleans a couple of weeks ago. And I said, I think the reason that they approached me was because I was a white guy with a notebook. And they thought that I must have some authority. And he said, that's absolutely why they did it. But of course, I have no medical training. And you can't imagine how dirty and filthy you get when you can't get a bath or anything like that. And the temperature is 100 degrees every day with no ice cubes, no air conditioning or anything. And I thought, boy, if anything were to happen, I couldn't live with myself. So I comforted her, as I say, as well as I could, and ran over to the casino, which was nearby, where they had kind of an ad hoc command center. And that was a nice thing because you had relief agencies from all over the country, right? EMTs and cops coming in. And they got an ambulance to her. And I don't know what happened, but that was kind of heartbreaking and touching at the same time. And one of the remarkable things, as I just mentioned, is how you saw people from all over. So there was a bridge over the Industrial Canal that I mentioned in my story. Maybe a week after the storm, I'm standing on that bridge and I'm talking to a Chicago police lieutenant who's got the black and white checkerboard strip on his police hat like Chicago cops do. And in the water is a Los Angeles swift boat rescue team puttering around. And I'm thinking, wow, I mean, that's amazing. I'm talking to someone from Chicago, and we got an LA rescue team here. So that was a remarkable thing. And, to use Faulkner, who started in New Orleans, obviously, and is a titan of the South, people endure. And it was incredible to me to just see these thousands of people that something terrible had happened to, but they endured. They were alive. They were fighting. And I think that was something that speaks really highly of people.
And I mean, I didn't even mention this, did you face any personal loss of home or any of that as well?
No, by grace of God, a lot of homes in my neighborhood were smashed to bits. It's kind of a heavily forested, and you can imagine how many trees were down. So no, by the grace of God, we weren't. But a number of my friends, a number of people who work at the paper, the flood came up to their roofs, so they lost everything. A friend of mine, David Meeks, who I mentioned in the story, I have a vivid memory of standing on Interstate 10, and we were putting him in a kayak, and he was going to go out to his house near Lake Pontchartrain. And where we were standing there on I-10, which is right near the downtown, it looked like Lake Pontchartrain. Just everywhere you saw was water. And in fact, there was a cemetery down below me to my left here, and there was Coast Guard crews and Zodiac boats going around the tombstones. Because as you know, we're buried above ground down here because a lot of it's below sea level. So yeah, it's certainly some images I'll never forget. And a lot of good friends of mine did lose everything, but by the grace of God, I didn't.
Is there anything else you'd like to leave people with about, your coverage, your time, the memory, any of that?
Well, I just hope people realize that, you do need to take things like this incredibly seriously, right? And it's easy to think this was they call it a storm in the century, right? Like once every 100 years. But you don't know that the next 100-year storm isn't going to be 3 or 4 years from now. All right. And then maybe you'll get 95 years without one. So I think that people on the whole should think they should be impressed by how people battled and to the extent people have come back, but they shouldn't forget just really how bad it was and how much was lost.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
That was it for the Miller Report, Real Clear Journalism. I'm Maggie Miller. I'll see you next time.